We're going to talk about fear today, and I'm going to contrast fear with courage, and I'm going to connect courage to love. So plant those three words in your mind. Fear on the one hand, and then courage plus love, or courage connected to love in some way. Now, why would we, isn't it strange that when I first started thinking about this, I thought, it's weird to consider fear of ice. You know, there is something called, in ethics, philosophy, theology, there's something called prudential fear. Prudential fear, i.e., things that we are rightfully afraid of and should act accordingly. Things that we're rightfully afraid of and should act accordingly. It's cautious and careful when genuine danger is present. And wisdom is called for at that point. Here's what I mean. A couple of examples. It's not wise to attempt to hold a black widow in the palm of your hand. Crawling into a cage with a wolf is a bad idea. I did see something on YouTube once where someone who was very skilled in dealing with wild animals and dogs pulled that off. But the person said, don't ever try to do this. If you live in the desert, since this is a class on desert spirituality, if you live in the desert, it's healthy to have a fear of rattlesnakes, scorpions. I was fascinated growing up with my dad. When he would be in shorts, there were 2 black holes in the back of his leg. 2 black holes. Well, how did that occur? He was walking out in the desert. Let me see if I can, jeez. Is it going to be one of those days? He was walking out in the desert, and got to be on your toes in the desert. You have to be on your toes in the desert, and he surprised a diamondback. A diamondback was sunning on a ledge above him, and when he walked by, he surprised it, and the snake struck. And the result was significant pain and damage to the back of his leg. So I remember walking with him out in the desert. He would say something like this, because we went out in the desert, my brothers and I with him quite often. Son, if you're walking and hear a rattle, immediately stop and stand still. I learned that lesson the hard way. After a night's sleep in the desert, he continued, always shake out your boots. Always shake out your boots. Scorpions crawl into them at night. Their sting, he said, is a nasty wake-up call in the morning. So a prudent, respectful fear in the desert is wise and rational. If I lived in the Gaza Strip today, or in the Ukraine, I'd be careful, and I'd be fearful. And I would be taking as many prudential steps as possible to care for my family's needs and protection. Now, stay with me. Stay with me. If you were to draw up a fear list, what would be on the list? Thank you. If you were to draw up a fear list, what would be on the list? What would appear there? Second question. Are those fears rational? Are they irrational? There's a difference between the two. Rational fears are valid. Prudential acts, if we're acting prudentially, we respond to them in a prudential, ordered fashion. We're careful because there are certain things in the world that are dangerous. We want to be aware of that. And those kinds of fears, as I'm defining it, are valid. During COVID, people had lots of legitimate fears and some irrational ones. Lots of legitimate fears and some irrational ones. I've lost my job. Will I get it back? In the meantime, how can I make ends meet? That's fair. We have to act prudentially at that point. My business is shut down. Will it open again? How will I care for my employees and pay the bills while I have things to resolve? What's going to happen? What about my kids? You ever fearful for your kids? What about my kids? Schools are closing everywhere. How will we manage as a family? I'm a single mother. The pressure is increasing every day. What if I run out of money? God's precious image bearers face significant mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual suffering during the epidemic. And some of that continues to this day. We're seeing that particularly amongst young people and children who had that long period of instability. Glib responses, insensitive responses don't help anybody. Well, let's talk about irrational fears for a moment. I talked about what I would consider some rational fears. Believe me, be careful around rattlesnakes. Irrational fears, how about those? Fears that just beyond our rational control. Our mind tells us not to be afraid while all our emotions scream, I'm not safe. Something's going to happen. Run, escape. So I looked up on Google common irrational fears. These are all from a site I found called Anxiety UK. 10 of them. Now, as I go through these, have your antenna up and, oh, that's me. Oh, that's me. Social phobia. Social phobia. Fear of interacting with other people. Agoraphobia. Fear of open public spaces. These are top 10. This is an interesting one. Emetophobia. Anybody, can you tell from that beginning of that word, emetophobia, what that one is? Fear of throwing up. And sometimes that plagues people have to speak a lot in public. One of the greatest fears would be, I hope I don't throw up. Emetophobia. Erythrophobia. Erythrophobia. Fear of blushing. That's one of the top 10. Fear of blushing. Driving phobia. Fear of driving. Some people never drive. I should probably be driving less. Hypochondria. Hypochondria. Fear of illness. Arachnophobia. Fear of spiders. Big black spiders are starting to appear in our home. They always appear in spring and summer. And you just be walking along and there's this big black spider suddenly there. One can jump. But you don't have to be terribly afraid. They're not black widows. They just look scary. Now think that. They just look scary. They look scary, but they're not going to harm you or me. Zoophobia. This is interesting. Zoophobia. Fear of animals. Fear of animals. Claustrophobia. Claustrophobia. Fear of enclosed, confined spaces. Would you like to serve on a submarine? Oh, interesting, isn't it? Fear of confined spaces, because in a confined space, we sense, I'm really not in control here. The space is in control. My younger brother is a caver. He's troubled. My younger brother is a caver, and he loves to go into caves, confined spaces, working his way through tight spaces. It is the last thing I would want to do. Aerophobia, fear of flying. And some of you know that about 15, 20 years ago, I used to have a fear of flying. Now, there's an aspect of these irrational phobias that makes some sense. But the overarching theme for these are, you're really safe. If you take prudential steps, you're really safe. You don't need to be afraid. You don't need to be afraid. Well, how do we trust God in a world where so many crazy things do happen? How do you trust God in a world where so many crazy things do happen? I had to work on that one for a long time. Particularly in my younger days, early 20s and so on. And one of the reasons why I had to work on it is I was constantly being exposed to what can happen in the world. I think I mentioned last week when I had this crazy job occasionally with the coroner's department in Los Angeles, you see a lot of things and you realize, it's dangerous and our bodies are really fragile. So how do we acknowledge the reality of the world as it is, not as we would wish it to be, but as it is, and yet not be overcome with fear, particularly fears that then can grow into an irrational fear? I think that's a good question. And it was a good question for the desert dwellers. All right, first thing, how can we begin to work the issue? The desert dwellers believed that a short memory is a problem. A short memory is a problem. They would argue for a lengthening of memory as one, not the only one, but a lengthening of memory is an antidote to fear. What do I mean by that? There's a wonderful story in Joshua. At the very beginning of Joshua, Israel's now entering the land promised to Abraham. The river Jordan, though, faces them. It's at flood stage. The Jordan's at flood stage. And Joshua acts on behalf of the Lord, touches the river with his staff, and the water, it says, it's a funny phrase, the water stops up upstream. The water keeps flowing that's already downstream. Now you have a gap in the river. The land, miraculously, is dry, not wet. And now Israel's going to be entering the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all the greats. They're entering the land, and there's going to be lots of challenges ahead because there's folks living there. There's folks living there in the land, and some of them are huge people. They're large. In fact, a report was later brought back about how large they were, and some people got really afraid. So what is Israel commanded to do? By God. Have priests go out into the center of the riverbed, right? Center of the riverbed, and take up rocks. And take those rocks and have Israel walk across while you're holding those rocks. Rocks. And then when the entire nation has crossed, the priests will follow the nation, go to the other side of the Jordan, the waters start rushing by again, but they're across. And what do they do with the rocks? Do you remember? They go to a place called Gilgal, and they make a monument. They make a monument. They stack up the rocks at Gilgal. Why? Why? They need and are called to, by God, to remember how God provided for them. I always have this picture of an Israelite granddad, and he's got his little Israelite boy, little grandson, and he says, come with me, come with me. And he comes out to that column of rocks, and the little guy looks up and he goes, Grandpa. He'd probably say something like, Abba, Abba, why are these rocks here? What do they mean? And the grandfather asks him back, well, what do you think they mean? And he ponders that, and the grandfather's response is, God has provided for Israel as a people. This column represents who you are, who God is, and God's provision on behalf of the nation of Israel. Now, I want you to ponder something then for a minute with me. What are the monuments in your life of God's provision on your behalf? Just think about it for a minute. If you came up with a monument list, what would be on the list? God wants you to remember. Because we'll all enter into situations where things don't look right. Where they don't look right, and we cannot reconcile what we're facing or have experienced with God's care, love, provision. God hasn't changed one whit. And he asks us to trust. And he says, remember, remember. Even if you can't make sense out of the situation you're facing, I can. Remember. So who's on that? What's on that list for you? So let's take a moment or two and listen to more counsel from the desert dwellers. They were aware of questions like this. They were human. They lived in a rough time in human history, rougher than the time we live in some ways. They faced, if you got ill back in those days, no penicillin. No penicillin. None of the medical wonders that are available to us. I was talking with my wife the other day, I think it was 2 days ago, and we were talking about these kinds of issues, and I said, you know, if we lived 150 years ago, everybody in the family would be dead. We'd be dead. All our kids would be dead. Everybody would be dead, because all of us have faced medical emergencies of one kind or another. And 150 years ago, folks would just say, well, God bless you. Now there's cures for cancer, that there weren't cures for cancer back in those days. And people just said, someone has consumption. They have consumption. They're being consumed by something. And people would watch other people waste away. Pain control, the kind of anesthetics that help us to control pain, none of them available. So the time in which the desert dwellers lived was, in some ways, a fearful time. And they would ask these same kinds of questions. The what ifs. What if I have an accident? Yeah, I specifically remember sayings of the desert fathers that have where they're asking these questions. Monks would be young, they'd head out into the desert. The years would pass, they'd start getting older. And then some would struggle with this question. I can't do what I used to do. Who's going to take care of me? Look what I've done. I'm out in the desert. I'm out here in this barren place. Is my community going to care for me? What if I get sick? What if I go blind? Some of the questions we might ask at that point would be some of these other ones. What if people don't like me? That's a more modern question. What if people don't like me? What if I never get a good job? What if I never get married? What if I die? Well, hello. What if I die? What if? So I do suggest creating your own what if list. It's good to get it out there in front of you, because sometimes this kind of stuff can swirl around in our subconscious mind, and we just know, I'm feeling troubled, I'm feeling anxious. If we can get it out on paper, get it in front of us, look at it, it might be helpful. Here's a more abstract definition of fear. An unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain, or a threat. Fear is related to vulnerability. The question we all face, am I safe? And I would say, yes and no. Yes and no, because the world's a dangerous place. We have to be aware of that. Yes, but the bigger word would be yes in block letters. Though the world is a dangerous place. We are vulnerable creatures. Our bodies are so vulnerable, so easily injured, and so on. So we find many desert dwellings dealing with fear. The fear of facing oneself, for example. This movement in the desert from self-deception to self-awareness, the fear of facing what I'm really like. The fear of not changing. You ever fear that? Man, it feels like I'm the same person I was 20 years ago. Am I ever going to change? And then the temptation towards cynicism or skepticism or presumption. I'll never change. I'll never change. Heck with it all. Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we are going to, yes, die. They face the same temptations that we do. Top of the list, probably the top of the list, the fear for them of never learning to love well. Now, let's take a moment. Think about all your web of relationships. Your web of relationships. Can you see it? Web of relationships in your life. Family, friends, acquaintances, and so on. Am I ever going to be able to love some of those people? Am I ever going to be able to love them? I don't even like them. How can I love them? You know, comes to mind, I have a journal, And in the back of the journal, I have lots of names written. Some of your names are there. And I realized the Lord nudged me a little bit, I guess. I realized I'm not praying for any of my enemies. I'm not praying for any of my enemies. And I heard kind of a word. I'll say kind of a word. And he said, well, write them down. Now, when you're chancellor of a university, you're constantly managing conflict all the time. 85% of the job is managing conflict. You always have somebody mad at you. Always. And when they get mad at you, they can say things. And you can say things back. And I realized, oh. And a name would rise to the surface of my attention of someone who in some way had said something, maybe sent an email. People are terribly courageous in emails. They would send an email. I'd walk into my office and Kim would be there, my assistant, and I'd look to her. Everything looked great for the day. I'd walk in and I'd say, well, who's lost their mind today? And all I had to do was turn on my email. And so you grow a list of people. I don't know if I would really call them enemies, but people who you just have a history with. And the Lord was asking me, write their names down in your journal. Start praying for them. And I said, all right. Growl a little bit, all right. And then he said, oh, God, no. He said, write Donald Trump's name there. Write Joe Biden's name there. And then I remembered in Scripture, Paul has said, pray for those in positions of power. I don't want to pray for them. I'm mad. Write their names down. Pray for them. And then write Vladimir Putin's name down. No. And this is, he in some ways is your enemy. And Jesus commanded, pray for your enemies. That's a lively commandment. But somehow, this dynamic of love, the willingness to have a circle in such a way that includes everyone, and then in the circle, what I would call the circle of God's providence, you start with your family, and you move out to your neighbors and friends, and then you move out to your colleagues at work, including the colleagues who don't like you. When I was provost at the university, I got, Kent faces this all the time. I got one email, I remember, you are the worst provost ever. I was tempted, write that name down. No. So who's on that list? How can we expand the boundaries of our love? See, what I'm going to be arguing for the next 5 or 10 minutes, if we expand the boundaries of our love, our fears diminish. They don't increase, they diminish. And the desert dwellers were clear on this. So Roberta Bondi, To Love as God Loves, that book I recommended, Roberta writes this: loving is natural. It's unnatural not to love. Yeah. We're incurvatus in se, if you remember that Latin phrase. We're bent creatures. Bent creatures don't like to love people. We want to be at the center. We want other people to love us. Well, I don't especially want to love them. Look at all they've done, how they've hurt me, how vulnerable I've been to them. And fear. Can you see how fear is connected to the refusal to love? Who are you not loving? Roberta says, loving is natural. It's unnatural not to love. Of course, most human beings fail to love or love badly a lot of the time. All right. This is because, now, here it comes. Follow now. This is because we're dominated by the fear of death and of our own physical and emotional, here's the word again, our physical and emotional vulnerability. And by our ways of compensating for this fear. Our ways of compensating for this fear. We need power over other people, she writes. We're afraid of the future. You afraid of the future? We suffer from envy, resentments, depression, hyperactivity, boredom, the list goes on. I get to talk about, this class has been expanded. I get to talk about 4 more vices. And among those vices will be envy. We'll work on that. So what's courage? What's courage? From a desert perspective, courage is the willingness to face what needs to be faced. I had to be so direct this morning. I'm including myself in the questions. The willingness to face what needs to be faced. So in your life, what needs to be faced that you're not facing? And you sense anxiety and fear are keeping you from facing what needs to be faced. Maybe there's a conversation that needs to take place. A conversation. Courage entails the willingness to hang in for the long haul with all our being. We're saying, I want it to stop. I want to move. I want to move from Malvern, where I live, I want to move from Malvern to Scottsdale. I'm sick of being here. I'm sick of, I got all these people living with me, are always demanding things. I have a big family now at home. All this stuff going on every day. I'm sick of it. I want to move to Scottsdale.
Don't do it, Chris.
It's warm in Scottsdale. It's hot in Scottsdale. There's lots of baseball in Scottsdale. I want to get away from what the Lord providentially has brought into my life. We're all facing situations like that, are we not? He's providentially allowing this to happen because what does he want to do? He wants to grow our ability to love. And as we grow our ability to love, oftentimes in relationships, we can love things other than people. Oftentimes in relationships, as we grow, the fear that has contaminated those relationships dissipates. Courage, the willingness to face what needs to be faced. I want to talk to you now about a specific desert dwellers. His name was Dorotheus of Gaza, interestingly enough. He lived a couple of hundred years after Antony. So he wasn't a desert dweller himself, although he knew desert teaching very well. And there's a very famous illustration that Dorotheus used that has to do with love. He's a very wise man. So I'm going to try to do this. I don't have anything to write on. I should have remembered that. No matter. We can pull this off. So I want you to imagine a circle. Okay, in your mind's eye, imagine a circle. We are all on the, what do you call the circumference? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I get a little scared now. So we have the circumference of the circle. Now at the center of the circle, in your mind's eye, put a dot. Yeah, is the dot there? Right at the center of the circle. And draw an arrow from where you are on the circumference of the circle. This is Dorotheus, on the circumference of the circle, to God at the center of the circle. In your mind's eye, you can picture that, yeah? Now we are all, let's just use this little community here for the sake of illustration. We are all on the circumference, yeah? And each one of us has drawn an arrow to the center. Now start, in your mind's eye, start moving toward the center. What's happening? What's happening to all the other people? They're moving closer to you. Get this, Dorotheus' point? His point is, the closer we draw to God, the God of infinite love, manifested to us, demonstrated to us in Jesus Christ, as we're moving toward that wonder, we're moving towards each other. And the closer we get towards the center, the distance separating us decreases dramatically. And Dorotheus thought that then love is the fundamental antidote for fear. Now, let's go back to courage. If we're on the circumference of the circle and we hear that invitation to move towards God, there's a part of us that will say, I don't know if I want to do that. Because if I move closer to God, I have to move closer to all those other people. And they're the ones making me afraid. They drive me crazy. I don't know if I want to do that. Now picture Jesus Christ at the center. And he's saying, listen, dear one, listen. It's safe. It's always safe. It's always safe to move toward me. I know you're afraid. It's always safe to move toward me. You will not be harmed by moving toward me. That is an impossibility. You might, no, here's the difference. I will not harm you, you will not be harmed. Oh, but you might experience some pain. From the desert dweller's perspective, from Jesus' perspective, pain does not equal harm. John Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople, late 4th century, said, the only thing that can harm you is sin itself. Not pain. And if those of us who are a little bit farther along the line know, the older we get, the more pain we experience. It's unavoidable. And someone with courage can look at a situation, acknowledge it for what it is, and then listen to Jesus at that very point. So we take the first big step towards courage by taking a huge step towards Jesus. And what he will say is, I will teach you how to love. I'll even teach you how to love your enemies. And we think, I don't know, I don't think that's possible. And he's insistent. He was insistent with his disciples. I will teach you how to love. So, some of us, now let me make some practical suggestions. Some of us may want to spend a few years simply pondering and praying about how can I get to know Jesus well. So, I've been at Good Sam since 1991. How many years is that? Don't tell me. I've been here that long. And by being here, there's an invitation to learn to love Jesus well and to learn to love other people well. Sometimes I say to myself, it's taken a long time, Lord. And he said, that's fine. We have all the time in the world. You're never going to be separate from me. Ever. Yeah, there'll be a time when you die, but you're not separate from me. No. In fact, the story will really open up for you at that point. Who is the Lord inviting me to love? Think of Jesus, the one who's asking us to do these things. Do they sound outrageous? Oh, that's just outrageous. You surely can't be serious. Well, this is the same person who in the Garden of Gethsemane said, my God, why have you forsaken me? God was skin on. Anybody would have been afraid. Gethsemane, a Roman trial, horror of crucifixion. Yet he courageously submitted his will to the will of his Father. And the will of his Father was his own will. They weren't arguing about this. Jesus is God incarnate. The two of them were of one mind. In his humanity, he's thinking, this is going to hurt. And it did. But in his deity, they're in full agreement. So what specific situations, dear ones, what specific situations are you presently facing that call for courage to be manifested? I'm sure we all have at least one. Man, I haven't called that person in a long time because I'm afraid of how they're going to respond. I haven't talked to the neighbor for a long time because we had an argument you would not believe. And what came out of my mouth, once the words were out, I couldn't get them back. Sometimes we demonstrate this kind of courage most in the midst of our fears. And gradually, if we can practice this, courage impelled by the power of the Holy Spirit dispels our fears. I'm frankly not afraid of some of the things I was afraid of in the past. It makes me smile. Courage and love lead to freedom. Freedom. In every area where you're afraid, invite Jesus in there, and the result will be freedom. Freedom, where when you see that person, whoever that person might be, you don't start walking in the opposite direction. You don't cross the street to walk on the other side. No, freedom. Some of you might be called to be regularly speaking in public someday. Some of you are a little bit younger and might have that role. Oh, I could never do that. Why? I get afraid when I stand up in front of people. See where freedom comes in? The freedom to say what needs to be said when it needs to be said. The freedom to keep quiet when you should keep quiet. freedom. All right, last thing. We all have a comfort zone. All right, let's go back to the circle. We all have a comfort zone, do we not? And within the circle are the things I'll be willing to consider. I'll be willing to consider. That's my comfort zone. So, homework. Identify your comfort zone's boundaries. All right? Identify them this week.
Example.
Yeah, well, my comfort zone when I was at Eastern for a long time, I just wanted to be a professor. You can't beat that life. You get paid to read books and write and teach. Best life in the world. That was my comfort zone. And the dad-burned president of the university kept bothering me. I think you're supposed to be involved in some way in administration. And I would say, no, that's nuts. That's nuts. And I remember one day I'm sitting in my office, and the Honors College is in need of a dean. And I realize it's in need of a dean. And the president of the university is sitting in my office. And I sensed the Holy Spirit saying, oh, you're going to have to move beyond your comfort zone. And I said, I don't know about that. You're going to have to move beyond your comfort zone. And I turned to the president and I said, well, I guess you're going to be needing a dean for the Honors College. Yeah, and he went, yeah. And then he looked at me and I looked at him and he said, you willing to be dean of the Honors College, which at that point was had some real difficulties. And I said, yeah. And that started it. That's what I mean. Moving beyond your comfort zone. How did you decide, I'm safe with these lines, with this circumference? How did you get there? Reevaluate. And remember this, I'm going to close now. God gets the last word. And that's good. God gets the last word, not fear. Not disillusionment. Not death. God gets the last word. And God's words, let me read them to you, sound like this: life, resurrection, hope, love, faithfulness, courage, perseverance, wisdom, compassion. The list goes on. I hear the desert dwellers saying, I hear Roberta Bondi saying, I hear Jesus saying, swallow these words. Swallow these words. Digest them. Be nurtured by them. They're words you can take with you into eternity. Lord bless and keep you all. Amen.